Hello, everyone, ladies and gentlemen, kids of all ages. My name is Abby, and welcome back to another episode of Gregtech New Horizons. Today, we're starting off mining up through a redstone vein. I was looking for redstone because it's something that we're going to require for further crafting, but also redstone can be used to enhance our tools, add efficiency to them. And eventually, I end up stumbling upon a bit of lapis in this vein as well. Uh, Both of these things will be used to upgrade our pickaxe. The redstone will be used to add haste, so we can mine faster. And the lapis will be used to add fortune. Because now the ores drop as ore chunks, then fortune has a much greater effect than it did have in previous versions of Gregtech New Horizons, where it would basically do nothing. But because of the ore chunks, it becomes much more useful. And because of a weird function with Tinker's tools, where you only need one piece of lapis on a tool for it to kind of snowball some more fortune on it. You don't see my tool have fortune now, but you will see it applied with the lapis eventually, and it will have fortune for the rest of the episode. And I had to do a lot of mining for this episode, but this was just the first bit. Redstone was important because I, for one, wanted faster tools, since taking down big trees was taking a lot of time, and also digging out these huge veins was taking a lot of time. And also, redstone was used for red alloy, but we'll get to that much, much later. My next goal was to make the Pam's Harvest Craft items. This was mostly just an accessory thing, because they're technically not required, but I want food, and you won't see me making food throughout the episode, but just know in the background that I'm making like the same 6 foods and putting them in lunch boxes and all that. This was just getting the stuff so I could make those items. There are a total of 8 Pam's Harvest Craft items, 8 Pam's Harvest Craft crafting items, that is to say, but we only had access to 4 of them. The other 4 take stainless steel, which we definitely don't have access to at this point. But in return, they can be made instead with Gregtech items, and that's, I guess, a fair trade. I then work my way towards making tree taps which can be used to tap rubber trees for sticky resin. What I need sticky resin for is going to be the water tank from Railcraft, which is the next thing that I'm working towards. It's not terribly difficult to make the tree taps. Again, it's just a bunch of microcrafting. It's nothing difficult. And yeah, and then I end up adventuring out, grabbing a few bits of rubber from some trees that I find across the countryside, and that's how I make the tank. After getting the resin, it takes 52 iron rods and 130 planks in order to make the 26 water tank sidings required for the water tank. It is the same structure as the coke oven, and the water tank generates water based on the humidity of the biome that it's in. We are in a cold plains biome, so it only has 20% humidity, and that's not great, because that means it only gets 2 milliliters of water per second, which is about a minute in order to get 1 bucket. So it's not great, but it is free infinite water at least, so that's good. I start work on digging out an area for a soybean farm. Soybeans can be used as a meat substitute, but really the reason I want soybeans is what I end up realizing is for something that I can't even craft until MV. So I end up just... But I still end up finishing the farm, and I also end up getting jump scared by something that almost killed me and destroyed a bunch of my chests. with that mild nightmare over, I end up finishing the soybean farm. The soybeans, they're pretty easy to turn into meat, so I might end up using them, but really I'm not that sure. I craft some bound leather, start getting tan leather set up, which I want for a sleeping bag eventually, and backpacks. And I also end up starting looking at where I'm going to go after this water tank, which is going to be the smeltery. I want the smeltery to get better tools, so that is the next goal. It takes a lot of sand, gravel, and clay. You know what that means? That means a montage, doesn't it? With all of the grout being made, I then ended up turning it all into unfired seared bricks, which can then be smelted into the successive seared bricks. The collecting of all the grout didn't take terribly long, and I turned it all into clay bricks so it would be easier to macerate. I also end up using the tan leather for something finally, and making that sleeping bag I was talking about. The good thing about the sleeping bag is I don't need to break it when I get up, and also it doesn't permanently set your spawn. So that's nice. That was mostly just to buy my time while the sear bricks finished smelting, and there they are. I would then need to, again, craft them together with water, because that somehow works, and that would end up being used to make the stuff for this, to make the sear bricks for the smeltery. I then start crafting the actual components for the smeltery. First making the smeltery controller wrong, and then making it correctly, and then making the seared tank, the drains, the casting channels for the drains, the casting basin, and all the things for it. The smeltery that the book has you make is extraordinarily small, and I end up expanding it later, but even now I still want to expand it more. But it's not really required. It's more just would be nice. But yeah, the casting basin is made, and the area for the smeltery is planned out. After filling the tank with lava, of course. Unfortunately, you can't make the casting table immediately in Gregtech New Horizons. You instead have to make seared stone in a smeltery in order to make it. That itself isn't terribly difficult. I use stone large plates because they smelt into 64 millibuckets instead of 36. Or actually, it's 18, I think, for regular cobblestone. And I also put gold in the smeltery to prepare for um, later casting. But with the seared stone, I'm able to make the casting table and thus finally finish off the quest for the Tinker's Smeltery, which is great. I get all ready and prepared to make the cast with my bronze tools, and then I realized something. You cannot make casts out of gold in Gregtech New Horizons. You can only make them out of aluminum brass. This means then I had to go looking for aluminum gravel and, well, the copper I already had for aluminum brass. And then I could finally make the aluminum brass for the casts. And make, eventually, the bronze tools that I so desperately wanted. Bronze isn't so obviously better than iron, but it is indeed, for at least pickaxes, a mining level higher than iron. Plus, it has a higher durability, and it's, aside from steel, the best tool that you can make out of a smeltery. So it's very useful right now. And we're able to get bronze in relatively high supply nowadays. So I use it to improve my pickaxe and all of my other tools. I also make the bronze longsword, mostly just because I like how the longswords function in Tinkers, but that became very, very, very quickly outdated, as you will see when I claim the rewards from this quest. And somehow, magically, I end up getting, well, obviously the aluminum ore berries, but also something I don't notice immediately in my inventory, the Pan of Doom. It is a very, very strong weapon. I decided to end up using both the Pan of Doom and the Bronze Longsword, mostly just because I'm not sure if it very quickly runs out of durability, the Pan, but, well, I still end up using it a lot. I also end up making 2 backpacks, or actually just the Digger's backpack right now, just to ease my way through some mining. I decided to round some things off with some loot games. The loot games I like a lot, but they're a little bit tricky some of the time. I heard there's a Minesweeper one, but I've only ever seen the Simon Says version of it. It's relatively trivial, just recruit after the block. I have a few kind of failures of a run, but this run ended up getting pretty far and finished the 3rd tier of the loot games, where it ended up showing me a completely different pattern for the 4th game, which I think is bullshit. Um, so there's kind of 3 rounds of loot games, and then there's a 4th one, which is a completely different pattern to all the games before it. So you have to learn a totally new one. And I do okay, but I don't end up doing it, and get some okay tier loot. Nothing actually terribly interesting. I do end up taking the oak drawers and the red alloy, but nothing else really piqued my interest. I was mostly looking for things like iron tank walls, if they had any there, but they didn't. Despite us ending off the last episode by making a small steam coal boiler, we aren't actually going to use that, because I hate that way of making steam boiler. We're going to make the solid fuel boiler from Railcraft instead, which I believe is much better. Though it is quite a bit more expensive, actually. Though the crafting itself isn't terribly difficult, and some of the components are done relatively easily, including the bronze firebox. However, the issue does come in with the bricks, which I don't want to make. So I end up instead taking a railcraft house and destroying it a little bit. These railcraft houses have a lot of bricks in it, and bricks are kind of just a pain in the ass to make. So for a lot of brick getting, at least in the early game, I like tearing down these railcraft houses, since they have hundreds of them. And I also tear down this house in the village for fun, I guess. With the extremely slow devastation finished, I now have all the stuff to end up finishing the solid fuel boiler. The solid fuel boiler doesn't make steam on its own. Well, none of the things make steam on its own, they take water. But it doesn't make steam on its own. It needs a low pressure, it takes a low pressure boiler top for it to actually work. And that is relatively cheap. That's literally just iron, so it's not any more difficult than what was already there. So there's the solid fuel boiler firebox, and pretty shortly here is the low pressure boiler tank. Hey, remember that water tank that we built like 3 minutes ago? Yeah, let's get rid of it. Let's move it. 20% humidity is not good. We're going to go up to 90%. We're luckily next to a bog, so this means that we can, instead of making 2 millibuckets of water per second, make 9 millibuckets per second, which is 4 times faster. The only issue is that then I would have to connect it up to my base, but I don't even have a steam area, so let's also get to work on that. A proper place to put all the steam machines. I end up getting caught in between a bit of a hard place with a bunch of infernal witches standing around. But it just goes to show how strong the Pan of Doom is, because it just totally gets rid of them, absolutely mercilessly. Really, ultimately, it's just that good. The extra hearts don't hurt either. Back to digging. With the area dug out, it's now time to start connecting up the water to where it's going to be going. For that, I use a bunch of small wooden fluid pipes, because that should ideally be enough. And really, setting it up is incredibly simple. It's just connecting all the pipes all the way down until you eventually get to where I want the boiler to be. In order to do that a bit more effectively, I end up doing this thing where we disable the input from one side of the pipes. Gregtech pipes are able to do sloshing, so doing this prevents basically any sloshing. It ends up causing the pipes to store a lot of fluid, but that's alright because water is effectively free. I just end up doing this for about 100-some blocks, as many as it takes to get there. And with that, the solid fuel boiler is made. This is what I'm going to be using for the rest of the steam age, though I do end up making it bigger at some point. But before that, I want to make the first steam machine, the steam alloy smelter. Yes, we're finally actually getting into steam power, and that requires more alloys. The recipe for the steam alloy smelter is not difficult at all. It is the brick bronze hole, it is some small bronze fluid pipes, and some furnaces. Really nothing difficult. And the alloy smelter is able to now make bronze at a 1-to-1 ratio rather than a 1-to-1/3 ratio, or 4-to-3 ratio as was previous. Before getting too deep into the rest of the steam machines, I decided to try and get myself a proper supply of steam, or proper storage of steam rather, and make an iron tank for it. This is not a very expensive craft, but it takes multiple stacks of iron to do. Still, it is totally worth it, as it will allow me to store 500 buckets of steam instead of maybe 50 or so that the small fuel boiler gets me on its own. So, here I'm doing some mental math just to see how many of the iron plates I'm going to need. It is going to be 60, but there you can see that it is a very, very expensive recipe. It takes a lot of iron, that's the truth. Lots of iron for the plates, lots of iron for the screws, but I end up getting it finished. There's the last of the rods, there's the last of the bolts, or last of the screws, and there's all of the walls shortly here. Not much more expensive is the iron tank glass, and also the iron tank valve, which is slightly more expensive, taking large bronze pipes, but nothing that some time, some copper, and some tin can't fix. I set up the Railcraft iron tank. I was a bit waffling around on where to place it, because I wanted some good endgame placement. Not endgame, but just good general placement, though I ended up deciding on this design. It's very simple to build. It is really just the cost, and I will be building more of these because I personally like the Railcraft tanks, and also they added a lot of Railcraft tanks. There's now one for almost every single metal tier, surprisingly enough. When I first started playing GTNH, it was just the iron and steel tanks, but now there's aluminum, titanium. It's pretty wicked. Anyways, connecting up the steam pipes doesn't take long at all, and there is our supply of steam fixed. Well, not fixed, but improved, because now I get 500,000 steam to work with. I make the stuff for an extra coke oven because I'm starting to run low on charcoal using it so much for the solid fuel boiler. I also end up making more coke ovens, but that's for later. I just put it in this corner where the water tank used to be. Also, this is going undermentioned, but I had to do a lot of mining for this episode. Of about the 14 hours of footage I recorded for this episode, probably more than half of that was just spent mining. And the hopeful goal is that at the end of this episode, we have gotten something that will alleviate those mining troubles, at least slightly. But this is just an idea of the type of mining I was doing for just hours on end. Anyways, I didn't like our current supply of steam, so I decided to make another set of steam boilers, or solid fuel boilers, and another set of low pressure tanks. It really wasn't terribly difficult, and now I have a 2x2x3 sized boiler box, which is able to make steam ridiculously quickly now. As things go, this is probably going to be good enough for the steam area. In fact, I might not even be using it for the steam area. I might use it just for LV later. But this is way overkill. Something I decided to work towards next that a lot of people would probably consider weird would be, I decided to make the windmill. The windmill is a multi-block added by Bartworks, and it's a kind of interesting one. It acts as sort of a macerator, but it doesn't use any power. Instead, it uses a rotor in order to macerate items slowly. But it macerates them 16 at a time, so it's not terrible. I end up using it a lot for wood, wheat, and stone. Because stone dust takes forever to macerate in a macerator. Wood just produces so much output that it's kind of a bit of a hassle to deal with a regular macerator. And in general, this acts as sort of just a parallel macerator for me. Plus, I just like it aesthetically, though I might tear it down eventually, especially once I get LV. It doesn't need to be there after that. But for right now, this was a very helpful supplemental thing. And also it was good for getting flour for wheat, for dough, and all those sorts of things. So it wasn't a terrible use of my time. And I like building it in all of my playthroughs because completionist. Top it off and place in the rotor, but I set up the rotor box a little bit incorrectly at first. It's time to get our next steam machine, which in this case will be the steam compressor. The thing that this is used for is used for a few things. It's used for making blocks of metals, and it's also used for eventually making compressed fire clay, but we'll get to that later. Either way, we need the compressor. It is the thing that's most essential for making the brick blast furnace, which is where we're going next. I also end up searching around to hopefully try and find a coal vein. Luckily, I find one pretty quickly and take a little bit of a delve into it, taking out some of the coal that's in it. I'm not looking for necessarily a lot of coal, but the 2 stacks I get from this initial trip is more than enough. What I want coal for is for coal coke. The reason why is because is kind of playing the long game for steel. Steel can be made with charcoal, which I'm making a lot of, but it is 4 times more efficient to use coal coke to make steel than it is to use charcoal. So I want the coal coke. After that trip, the iron is done compressing and I can make myself 2 anvils. One of those anvils goes straight into making another steam machine. In this case, the steam forge hammer. It doesn't take much longer. The thing that the steam forge hammer does that is really great to us is it provides a 3-to-2 plate recipe. No longer is it 2 ingots to 1 plate. It is now 3 ingots to 2 plates, which saves us a ton on resources, especially where we're going, which requires a lot of plates. let's knock out a third one while we're still at it. Let's get the steam extractor. This one is also a relatively simple machine, and we don't actually end up using it in this episode, but we will need it later for rubber. The steam extractor is a relatively simple craft. The most difficult thing about it is the glass, which you really just have to chisel out from clear glass that you make in a smeltery. Nothing complicated at all. And I hook it up just like the rest of the steam machine. I thought to myself that this would be the last steam machine that I end up making, but I end up forgetting one that you'll see pretty shortly here too. It is now time to get to the next big goal, making the bricked blast furnace. This thing is expensive, but it's not something that we're unable to make. It's clay, it's bricks, it's calcite, it's gypsum, it's all things that we can get with relative ease, even if we don't have it right now. So, let's start. I end up having to take a small break in my collecting for the brick blast furnace just to get the stuff for the steam macerator, because I realized that I want ore doubling on my calcite and gypsum, so I don't need to mine 72 ore, and only need to mine up 36. So that's what I spend my next few minutes doing, making up the steam macerator. And then back to work. I make a bunch more coke ovens to end up filling my area with, and I place them underground. This is just so that I can get a bunch of cold coke way quicker, way faster, all for the brick blast furnace, which we are basically just making the components for right now. I do some checking to make sure that I'm not on any chunk borders, but I have all the raw materials for it. It just needs to be processed into the materials for the brick blast furnace. So now it's basically just a waiting game. I use the windmill to turn the bricks into the brick dust, and I use the macerator, the steam macerator, to turn the calcite into calcite dust and the gypsum into gypsum dust, and also eventually the clay into clay dust. I make the 4 iron furnaces for it. And not too much long after, my last piece of gypsum dust is running through the macerator. I start forge hammering the crushed gypsum dust, the crushed gypsum ore, into impure gypsum dust, which I can just wash in a cauldron in order to get the actual gypsum I need. And I start running the clay through the macerator as well. macerating clay gives double the output that just putting it with a mortar would. So that's the way I want to do it. With the clay starting to be finished macerating and the bricks already done macerating, I can start making the fire clay dust required for making the fire bricks for the brick blast furnace. It's just as simple as crafting the two of them together and then putting them through a compressor in order to get the compressed fire clay. This is a quick process, but it's not a very quick process. It still takes about 8 seconds for each bit of compressed fire clay. So in the meantime, I end up gathering some sand to make some more coke ovens. Six coke ovens might seem excessive, but I assure you we're going to be totally fine. These coke ovens are going to be put to good use eventually, that's for sure. For right now, they'll be making our coal coke, but they'll get repurposed later, that's for sure. And they make it relatively quickly. The creosote will be a bit to handle though. After just a little bit longer, all of the fire clay is done, and it is just the smelting job left to turn all of the compressed fire clay into the fire bricks. After the smelting is finished, then it's a little bit more complicated to turn the fire bricks into the actual fire bricks for the recipe, but, well, we have all the resources for it right now. The smelting is done, and it is over to the crafting station. To make things easier, this crafting is using a forestry workbench. I made the forestry workbench a little bit earlier. It's not expensive at all. This allows us to effectively store recipes, and it allows for way, way, way quicker crafting, especially for something that's as recursive as these crafts for these fire bricks. So it turns the normally pretty weird, pretty boring and pretty tedious crafting of fire bricks into a simple couple-click operation, which is extremely nice. To make fire bricks, you need concrete and gypsum in the fire bricks that we already settled on. And we need 36 total for our first brick blast furnace. The concrete takes the calcite, the stone dust, the clay dust, and the quartz sand that we got before. And that is pretty much it. It's a pretty expensive craft. It is your first real super expensive item in the pack, but steel is incredibly necessary and incredibly good, so it makes sense. And we'll be making a few more of these, don't you worry. It's just a bit daunting at first. Now we set it up in the underground, a 3x4x3 structure with a pretty simple build to it. We're going to be making a lot more of these babies later, and they get a little bit simpler later on, but now we just shove in the coal coke and shove in the iron, and it'll take 40 minutes to make 10 ingots of steel. But through the power of video editing, we can make it take 4 seconds. Hey, look at that. There's our steel. Yay! Now what are we gonna do with steel? Well, there's a lot of things to do with steel, but the way I want to use steel for this episode is I want to use it to make one very, very specific thing. Ultimately, the place we're looking up towards is making alumite to end up making the tool forge. The tool forge allows us to make hammers. And hammers mine in a 3x3 area. That is the thing that I'm aiming for. I'm aiming to get hammers so that mining becomes much, much, much more trivial. Alumite, however, is a little bit pricey, but it ain't too bad. We've gotten obsidian through a few quest rewards, and the aluminum gravel allows us to get aluminum dust. Combining that together, it's alumite right there. So, let's start mastering some of that aluminum gravel in order to get some of that aluminum dust. Once all that aluminum is finished, I then start macerating some of the obsidian in order to make the obsidian dust that is also required for the recipe. And also eventually steel dust for the alumite dust. I could make it in the Tinker's smeltery, but I decided against that because the Tinker's smeltery is really small, and also I like Gregtech microcrafting. Not too long later, we got all the stuff to make the alumite dust, and we crafted stray in our crafting table. We have enough for what would be 27 of it, 24 of it, and that's all right. That'll do it. That'll do us for now. And more importantly, it allows us to pour out our first bit of alumite ingot. But we don't really want the alumite ingots, do we? No. You see, for the tool forge, you need the alumite large plates. You need 2 alumite large plates for each tool forge, for a tool forge. And we already have the 16 alumite that we need for it. So it is just a matter of pouring it out into the casts, and then we can just make it. The miscellaneous components for the tool forge also come quick. The seared stone slab and all the rest. Ultimately, it is not expensive at all. Well, I wouldn't say it's not expensive at all. It's slightly expensive, but more so, I'm glad to finally have the tool forge because this means that we can get the hammer, we can get the lumber axe, we can get the excavator. It will alleviate a lot of pressure that has been put onto us. A lot of the more menial, grindy parts are going to become very simplified, and expanding the base out is going to be much easier. But that is going to be a task for another time. I hope you all enjoyed, and I'm glad I was able to put this out on a somewhat consistent schedule. I want to be on a vaguely consistent schedule of maybe once every 2 weeks, but finals are coming up, so no promises for an episode on the 16th. Let's just say that. But I'll try. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you all next time. Toodles then.